Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel where we try to hook you up with ideas and theories and discoveries that you probably have never heard of before. But if you did, they would profoundly affect your life. We've been doing a lot of Bible decodes in the last several months. And coming out of the New Testament, we've been exploring a lot of different aspects of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, that the New Testament was written in whole or in part by the Caesars, in particular the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. That includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. That was from 69 until 96 AD, which is right exactly around the time that the Gospels were written, according to scholars. And what they did is they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 years, put Jesus in 30 to 33 AD range for his ministry. And then at the same time, they wrote a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews that took place in Judea, resulted in the complete destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The war lasted from 66 until 73 AD. And both Vespasian and his son Titus were generals in that war before they actually became emperors. And so Vespasian and Titus are really like the protagonists of this book, 7 volumes, called War of the Jews, or the Jewish War. And that went out under the name of Flavius Josephus, which I believe is a pseudonym for a non-existent person, but historians are pretty much unanimous that Josephus existed and that he's one of the great historians of all time. But the Roman origin hypothesis basically says that both the New Testament and the works of Josephus, so we're really talking about the two most read books in all of history, that they both are frauds. They both were written as fiction, as psychological operation or psychological propaganda by the Roman Caesars, who had a proclivity for using psychological propaganda, and who had a very clear motive to do this, which was basically to domesticate or tame or absorb or neutralize the Jews. The Jews for over 100 years had been a major thorn in the side for the Romans. They were always revolting, uprising, and insurrecting, going back to even the beginning where the Romans pulled into Judea in 63 BC. And Titus and Vespasian were both wounded in the war, and I think they had just had enough of the Jews, and they came up with a plan. They knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. The Messiah that the Jews were waiting for, though, was a military leader who would come in and help the Jews overthrow the Romans. Now, obviously, Titus and Vespasian did not want that. But they actually really were eyewitnesses to that when 3 really candidates for Jewish Messiah rose up in 66 AD and expelled the Herod puppet kings of Jerusalem. And so these people were, according to Josephus, they were named Simon, Eleazar, and John. These are the three Jewish zealots who were literally messiahs for the Jews until Emperor Nero called in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And eventually it led to his son Titus completely destroying Jerusalem. But the threat was still there. They knew that the Jews had incredible resilience. They had their separatist religion with their monotheistic, zealous, and jealous God, who also had obsessive compulsive disorder and a smoking addiction to animal fat, and very indecisive, insecure, and this kind of led to the Jews being very xenophobic and separatist. So this is not what the Romans wanted. The Romans wanted somebody that you could absorb into the empire, including their religion. That's really the tack that the Romans used on all of the hundreds of different tribes and nations that they had under the empire, is that they tried to absorb you, absorb your religion, tolerate your religion as long as you tolerated theirs. But that's not what the Jews were doing. And so, the Romans hatched this scheme. And if you look at the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Luke, and you look at Josephus's War of the Jews, you will eventually come to the conclusion that they were written by the same person. Now, I'm not saying everybody in history has done that, but if you kind of already have the kind of the cipher, or you know what you're looking for, then you will see that the parallels between Josephus and the Gospels are legion. Joseph Atwill, for one example, in his book Caesar's Messiah, looks at events from Luke during the 3-year ministry of Jesus and the events of Titus during his 3-year military campaign in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order. And they each encounter parallel events at every location. The events that they encounter are not the same, but they are typologically similar or analogous, or they have similar themes, parallel themes. And they are also separated by exactly 40 years. And so the ministry of Jesus is a copy of the 3-year military campaign of Titus. But that's not even scratching the surface of the evidence. And we're not talking about just a couple of events. We're talking about 40 plus events that are all in the same order and that evoke a parallel theme and are set off by 40 years at the same locations. But then Michael Menescotz comes along in his book, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, and he looks into also the book of Luke, looking for parallels with War of the Jews. He found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. The book of Luke is only 1,151 verses. Many of these parallels occupy several verses in Luke. And so the upshot is that the book of Luke is literally saturated with parallels from War of the Jews. Every single chapter has like at least 6 parallels in it. And some of the parallels are breathtaking in their complexity, their detail, and just how well hidden they are and how well constructed they are. Some of them are relatively trivial and could easily be dismissed standing alone. But then when you group them together with hundreds of others, it's hard to say that any of them are accidental. But not only that, to definitely show that they are not accidental, Meniscotz, that's Menasgotz, he diagrams the parallels. He puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Wherever he finds a parallel, he plots a point, puts a dot there. And after plotting the 250 plus parallels, he formed 5 near perfect letters in Latin. Latin being the language of the Caesars, the preferred elite Roman language. They also spoke Greek over there, which is the language of the New Testament, in contrast to Judea, where Greek was much less well known and written. And so these 5 letters in Latin are APTVS, Titus Vespasianus, or Titus Vespasian. And then the AP may stand for Agia Pneuma, Holy Spirit, or possibly Arius Piso, who was a shadow player in the Flavian court, from one of the most powerful families of Rome. Both Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, in their works dating back to the late 70s and early 80s, they both independently determined that the New Testament was written by Arius Piso. Even though this is a person who doesn't really show up on the historical record. He's only really alluded to in letters written by other Roman royals such as Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. And they say that both of them say that the New Testament was basically written by him and the rest of his family. And not only that, they used multiple aliases that they both dug out by reading the letters that were written between all of these different characters, and basically doing like a shell game of names. Keep watching for all of the name switching, and they determined that not only did Arius Piso write the New Testament, or at least large parts of it, and the rest of his family wrote the rest of it, but they wrote a ton of other stuff, including really all the Apocrypha, Josephus, and the Church Fathers, such as St. Ignatius and Origen and St. Augustine. These were all written, and the Septuagint, Aristotle. These even works that weren't even in the same century that they were writing in. They a lot of times they rewrote this stuff to historicize it. So the Septuagint is supposed to be the Greek version of the Old Testament. And the story was that in the 3rd century, all of these Jewish scholars, 70 of them, that's Septuagint, got together at Alexandria and wrote up the Old Testament in Greek. but they added several other verses in there to basically historicize the story of Jesus. So they put in a couple new prophecies that predicted events that are written in the New Testament, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't buy into the whole theory 100%, but I think it's interesting in its level of devastation and also in its level of erudition, because these people basically took it as a detective story. They would dig out just a piece of information here, a quick name over here in this letter. You know, they had to put it together like the pieces of a puzzle, and they both came to the same conclusions. But anyway, the main point about the APTVS pattern is that the Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they literally signed their name to it. They wanted to be discovered eventually for doing what they did. And I think they would be shocked to find out that their psychological operation has actually lasted for almost 2,000 years before being discovered. It has been discovered by many people in the past, some of whom wrote books or even their entire works about it, but mostly in code. I think Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, along with possibly James Ballantyne Hannay and Bruno Bauer in the Hannay in the early 20th century and Bauer in the late 19th century, have explicitly stated that the Romans wrote the New Testament. Now, what we're doing today, again, this is our third installment of the case for Christ as the case for Caesar. We're looking at the work of Lee Strobel. He's a Christian apologist, a newspaper reporter, a court reporter who flew all over the country interviewing some of the luminaries of the Christian apologist movement, the scholars that scholars on particular subjects like the resurrection or the crucifixion or different aspects of genealogy or family or medicine for the poisoning and the like there's a passage where they talk about that blood is combined with water, and there's like a medicine guy that says, oh yeah, well that's a legitimate condition, that really happened. So we'll get to that. But anyway, the interesting thing about Strobel's book, and he incidentally has dozens of other books that are all on the same theme: the case for the crucifixion, the case for the virgin birth, the case for water into wine, and all of these different legal based kind of Christian apologists books, is that the arguments that the scholars make for the case for Christ, they actually make a better case for the case for Caesar. In a lot of places, they evoke William of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the most likely, and there is no, so we have to resort to God did it because there is no rational explanation. And that's because they don't know about the Roman origins hypothesis, which provides, in many, many cases, a rational explanation for these things. Okay, so now we're going to start talking here. I think we're in chapter 4, maybe, and he's talking about some of the, I think this is this Japanese guy, Yamauchi. And he's talking about some of the historical sources that corroborate the existence of Jesus. And of course, all of those sources are Roman royalty. Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Trajan. They're all Suetonius. They're all either were emperors or were right next to the emperor, and so these don't count anymore because of the Roman origins hypothesis. Of course, the Romans would corroborate the existence of Jesus if this is part of a psychological operation that they're doing. Now, the Romans were pros at this. They created a number of other religions in the first century, and they had a monopoly on publishing, they had a monopoly on censorship, they had a monopoly on distribution. They were the only people who could have done it. And it's exactly right down the alleyway of their MO. So this author is now talking, he's being asked by Strobel, how important are these Roman writers? And he's like, it's very important. And so now he's talking about the corroborating text of Tacitus from 115 AD. So in AD 115, he explicitly states that Nero persecuted the Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the great fire that had devastated Rome in AD 64. Now, the Roman royals, especially of the Flavian dynasty, they hated Nero. And Nero, I believe, was a scapegoat of these Flavians. Roman Piso also believes that Nero was actually a good guy, and that he was much more favorable to the Jews than Titus and Vespasian were. But they created the story of him persecuting Christians, doing the Christians versus lions thing. At this time, in AD 64, the boundaries between Christians and Jews was very perforated. And I believe, along with the scholar Candida Moss, that the Christian persecution is much, much, much overstated, and that a lot of the Roman persecution of Christians was actually persecution of Jews. Including this event here, Nero persecuted the Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the great fire that had devastated Rome in AD 64. AD 64, again, this is all fiction, because the Romans didn't even come up with the idea of Jesus until probably around this time, AD 64. Roman Piso indicates that he thinks that, this was brewing in the background for a little while before Vespasian and Titus actually tried to execute the plan to write this universal religion psychological operation. Okay, so now Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. So that is that's Tacitus there. So that's what Tacitus in his histories has to say about the Christians. And again, this whole passage is, in my mind, moot because it was written by Tacitus, who was a good buddy of the Flavians and hung around at the court of the Flavian Caesars. Even in this later period, at this point, Trajan was the emperor. Okay. Now Yamauchi's saying, crucifixion was the most abhorrent fate that anyone could undergo, and the fact that there was a movement based on a crucified man has to be explained. How can you explain the spread of a religion based on the worship of a man who had suffered the most ignominious death possible? Of course, the Christian answer is that he was resurrected. Others have to come up with some alternative theory if they don't believe that. Well, I think I have articulated the alternative theory earlier in this video, but it is that this is a fiction that was written by the Romans, and they wrote in the whole part about the crucifixion, and they wrote in the whole part about the resurrection. And so that is the alternative theory, that none of it actually happened, but it was written down. Okay, how important is this reference, I asked. Very important. It was probably written about AD 111, and it attests to the rapid spread of Christianity both in the city and in the rural area among every class. I think that's another quote from Tacitus right there. So, the apologists are saying that not only, was the story of Christianity real, but the story spread very quickly all over the empire. Okay, now we're talking about a guy named Habermas, Gary Habermas. He's written about a historian named Thallus, who in AD 52, I seriously doubt that date, but Thallus, who in AD 52 wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world since the Trojan War. Although Thallus's work has been lost, it was quoted by Julius Africanus in about AD 221. It's a little bit more like it, AD 221, and it made reference to the darkness that the Gospels had written about. Like, so when Jesus was crucified, it became dark for 3 hours or something like that. And they're explaining that it was dark all over the world at this time, and this is not evidence. But anyway, even if it is, let me quote what scholar Paul Meyer said about the darkness in a footnote in his 1968 book, Pontius Pilate. He said, reading these words, "This phenomenon evidently was visible in Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean cities. According to Tertullian, who was one of the church fathers and who was also a pen name under the Romans, it was a cosmic or world event." See, that's all it takes for these Romans to historicize this, is just to insert one or two comments in the historical record, and the Christians go for it. And so that's what we have with the whole history of Christianity, is a tidbit here, a tidbit there, a tidbit there, and they all kind of justify the greater story with, Tertullian says it was a cosmic or world event. That's it. Now, I admit that I was just saying that that Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin did the same thing with their building up of all the alias names that Arius Piso used to write under. That's a little bit different, because the sources are much tighter. We're talking about just the letters that were written among the Roman royals. That's the source material that they're getting these bits and pieces from. But the Christian apologists are getting their bits and pieces from anywhere, any source at any time. Now they're going to the Talmud. Passages in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was written by Pharisaic Jews, but it's a product of the Flavians, because just after the war, at the same time that they were creating Christianity, the Flavians were also creating what you call rabbinical Judaism, taking the Pharisees, who had almost exactly the same story as Josephus, and giving them a land grant to establish a campus for the study of the Jewish scriptures, as long as you don't say certain things, as long as because it's under the Flavian imprimatur or sponsorship. And the Talmud is something that they came up with over the centuries, not only in Palestine but also in Babylon. And the important thing about these rabbis, these Pharisaic Jews, is they literally were eyewitnesses to the creation of Christianity by the Romans, exactly the way they created rabbinical Judaism. And so they knew that Jesus was a fiction, and they mock him repeatedly in the Talmud. So he says, passages in the Talmud that mention Jesus, calling him a false Messiah who practiced magic and who was justly condemned to death. They also repeat the rumor that Jesus was born of a